Hello chess lovers and welcome to Chess Insight. In this video we're going to look at a fascinating chess battle between two legends, Mikhail Tal and Tigran Petrosian, played in 1972. In this game, we'll witness how Petrosian's incredible positional understanding completely neutralized Tal's sharp tactical play. Here, Petrosian had the white pieces, while Mikhail Tal played as black. The game began with knight to f3. The Reti Opening. The main reply here is knight to f6, while another possible response is pawn to d5. If black goes for pawn to d5, the game can transpose into the Tennyson Gambit with pawn to e4, or even transform into a King's Indian attack setup with pawn to g3. But Tal wasn't interested in those complex lines. He chose the main variation with knight to f6. White continued with pawn to c4, black replied pawn to e6, followed by knight to c3 and pawn to d5. Petrosian then pushed pawn to d4, heading into the queen's gambit declined, while Tal countered with pawn to c5. Now, capturing the pawn on c5 immediately would be a mistake, because it allows black to quickly develop with bishop takes pawn, gaining tempo and freeing his kingside for castling. So, instead, Petrosian played pawn takes pawn on d5. The best response for black here is pawn takes pawn, but Tal chose knight takes pawn, and white immediately struck with pawn to e4, attacking the knight. Tal exchanged pieces, knight takes knight, and white recaptured with the pawn. But let's pause for a moment. If black had tried to retreat the knight to f6 instead, white would have pushed pawn to d5. After pawn takes pawn and pawn recaptures, white would get a dangerous passed pawn on the d-file, which would be quite unpleasant for black. Alright, back to the actual game. After the trades, Tal captured on d4 and white responded pawn takes pawn. Now, Petrosian had a pawn majority on the king side, while Tal had a 2-1 pawn majority on the queen side. Tal continued with bishop to b4 check, preparing to castle short. Petrosian blocked with bishop to d2, and Tal immediately exchanged bishops. After queen takes bishop, Tal castled short. Petrosian then developed his bishop to c4, and Tal brought out his knight to d7. White castled short, and black pushed pawn to b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop on b7. At this point, when your opponent has a pawn majority on the queen side, the correct counter strategy is to launch a minority attack, pushing your pawns to provoke weaknesses. That's exactly what Petrosian did with pawn to a4. The goal was to trade pawns on the queen side and then target the remaining weak pawns. This is a fundamental concept in positional chess. Tal continued with bishop to b7, eyeing the center pawn on e4. Petrosian defended with rook to e1, and black replied rook to c8, activating the rook along the open file and targeting the bishop on c4. Petrosian calmly repositioned his bishop to d3. Here, the best move for black would have been pawn to a5, stopping white's pawn advance. But instead, Tal made a critical mistake. Knight to b7. Perhaps his idea was to reroute the knight to c6. But this allowed white to push pawn to a5, gaining space. Tal followed up with knight to c6, attacking both the pawns on a5 and d4. Petrosian replied with pawn takes pawn on b6. And here came the blunder that cost Tal the game. Tal played knight takes pawn on d4. Maybe he thought that after knight takes knight and queen takes knight, he could bring the rook to d8 and win the bishop. But that calculation failed. Because after pawn takes pawn, white ended up with a passed pawn, just one step away from promotion. Tal tried to increase pressure with rook to d8, but white simply played rook to a3, defending the bishop. If black tried to capture on e4 to win the exchange, then after rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, and bishop takes queen, white would be completely winning. Even if black recaptured with the rook, white could play pawn to h3, and eventually the passed pawn would decide the game. So, Tal avoided the capture and played bishop to a8 to stop the pawn from advancing. Petrosian then played pawn to h3, creating luft or breathing space for his king. Now why h3 instead of g3? Because h3 creates an escape square on h2, a dark square, opposite to black's light-squared bishop, meaning the king cannot be easily attacked later. Tal also tried to create luft with pawn to h6, but that was actually a mistake. It weakened the light squares near his king, the same color as white's bishop. Petrosian then played rook to c1, offering a rook trade to simplify the position. Tal delayed the exchange and played queen to b6 instead. White traded rooks anyway, and after black recaptured, Petrosian placed his rook on a2 to guard the second rank. Tal doubled down with rook to c7, attacking the pawns, but Petrosian calmly played queen to a3, defending the pawn and offering a queen trade. If black accepted, white would recapture with the pawn, and if black tries to attack the bishop with rook to c3, white simply retreats, bishop back to e2. Black rook captures the pawn and white immediately responds with pawn to e5. At this point, no matter what move black plays, the game is lost. For example, if the rook takes the pawn, white calmly plays bishop to f3, forcing an exchange. After bishop takes bishop and pawn recaptures, there's simply nothing left for black to do. The passed pawn will promote, and the game is completely over. So, Tal declined the trade and played queen to b3, attacking the rook. Petrosian dropped the rook back to a1. Tal went rook to d7, coordinating with his queen to attack the bishop. Petrosian calmly retreated bishop to f1 and once again offered a queen trade. Once again, Tal refuses the queen trade, this time playing queen to b2, attacking the rook. White immediately responds with queen to a3, keeping the tension alive on the board. Mikhail Tal plays queen to b6, and Petrosian responds with queen to a5, once again offering a queen trade. Of course, Tal declines. Queen to b2, keeping up the pressure on the rook. White goes queen to a3, repeating the offer for what feels like the 100th time. And again, Tal refuses with queen back to b6. At this point, it seems Tal is perfectly fine with a draw. If Petrosian had played queen to a5, the game would have ended in a repetition, as both players were repeating the same sequence of moves. But instead, Petrosian chooses queen to a6, and Tal immediately replies with queen to c5. White plays queen to b5, answered by queen to d4 and then queen to a4. Once again, Petrosian offers a queen trade, and here Tal made another blunder, queen to d6. This allowed white to play rook to b1, ready to invade the 8th rank. Black had to defend with rook to d8, and white played queen to a5. If at this point black dared to capture the e4 pawn with the bishop, white had a stunning tactical shot, queen takes rook check. If queen takes queen, then rook to b8 would pin and win the queen. If the queen captures the rook, the pawn would simply promote to a new queen. And if black tries to defend with queen to f8, white replies with rook takes queen, check. After king takes rook, white continues with bishop to e2. Then king to e7, followed by bishop to f3, and white is completely winning. Back to the actual game. Tal moves his king to h7, and Petrosian continues with e5, attacking the queen. Tal steps aside with queen to d4. White brings the rook up to b8, answered by rook to d5 from Tal. Then Petrosian plays queen to a3, and here, Mikhail Tal resigns. As we can see, the light-squared bishop on a8 is hanging, attacked by the rook. If Tal tries to save it with bishop to c6, the pawn would promote to a queen. And if he defends with rook back to d8, white would capture. Rook takes rook. After queen recaptures, white gives a strong check with queen to d3, forcing a queen trade. This is the direct consequence of Tal's earlier mistake, creating luft on the light square h7. If he had instead created luft on the dark square g7, the game could have lasted longer and might have ended in a draw. After queen takes queen, bishop recaptures with check. If black blocks with pawn to g6, white calmly plays pawn to f3, preparing bishop to e4 next. And if black tries pawn to f5, white can capture en passant. If black responds with pawn to e5, then white continues with bishop to e4, forcing black to capture with his own bishop. And after pawn takes bishop, the pawn will eventually promote no matter what. Alright, chess lovers, that was a brilliant positional masterpiece by Tigran Petrosian, defeating the tactical genius Mikhail Tal. Hopefully, this game gives you new insight into how strategic planning can overcome sharp tactics. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. See you again in the next chess analysis video.